Imagine this, a world beneath the surface, where light fades and shadows dominate, where every breath is a lifeline and the unknown lurks just beyond reach. For most, the idea of donning heavy, confining underwater gear and venturing into a pitch-black, sediment-choked tunnel would be a nightmare. But for a few daring souls, it's an irresistible call to adventure. Diving has existed for centuries, but it wasn't until the 1950s that recreational diving truly exploded in the United States. Back then, gear was primitive compared to today's technology, and divers were trained to endure what most would fear. Take Murray, a diver trained by the US. His expertise earned in the vast open waters. But today, we're going somewhere far more dangerous. Welcome to the world of cave diving, where the stakes are higher, the risks greater, and every dive could be your last. Nonetheless, he was one of the most experienced and respected divers in the diving club, as many of the other members were weekend warriors with little to no official training, and they all looked up to him. The club's amateur divers were always excited to go into the water with Murray, since he knew so much more than them and could teach them what he knew. Garu. Murray had been contemplating diving Radium Springs for a while, and when he proposed the idea to a fellow club member, Donald Garu, he was anxious to accompany Murray. By mid-1955, Murray and Donald were both experienced cave divers, who had been in some dangerous circumstances over the years. As a result, they were well aware of the risks associated with their chosen sport. They took safety seriously, but they saw danger as part of the alert. Murray and Donald were adrenaline junkies long before the phrase was invented. They also appreciated the companionship and thrill of exploring caves that few, if any, had ever visited before. Decades later, divers and geologists concluded that Radium Springs Cave complex was 1,500 feet, or 475 meters long, and had an unusual honeycomb structure. However, Murray and Donald had no idea how large it was, how many corridors and rooms it had, how deep it extended, or what unknown offshoots it included in 1955. They were both excited to begin the excursion when they arrived at the cave on Friday morning in the summer of 1955. Murray and Donald were excited about a deep, undiscovered dive, but they also wanted to explore and map as much of the cave as possible. To make the most of their limited time underwater, they decided to separate shortly after entering the cave. This would allow them to cover a bit more ground than if they stuck together. However, it was absolutely problematic in terms of safety, because they wouldn't be able to support one another if something went wrong. But, given the circumstances, it felt like a decent trade-off. Soon after arrival, Murray and Donald began preparing their gear and suiting up. However, it is worth mentioning that their equipment was significantly heavier and bulkier than modern-day diving gear. High-quality commercial diving equipment was not available back then. To save as much money as possible, many divers, like Murray, built their own gear and oxygen tanks out of discarded equipment and odds and ends found at local hardware stores. It was nearing midday when Murray and Donald waded out from the shore into the blue water. When they reached roughly chest depth, they placed their regulators into their mouths, dropped beneath the surface, and began the short descent to the partially officially camouflaged 3-foot cave opening at the bottom of the spring. Before entering the cave, they chose not to secure a safety line at the entrance. In principle, the queue would direct them to the exit if they became lost or experienced a critical equipment failure. Safety lines are especially critical for divers exploring unfamiliar cave systems. This is especially true in sediment-filled caves, where visibility can plummet to almost nil in the blink of an eye. Then, Murray and Donald glanced through the tight entrance into the cave. While their eyes were accustomed to the darkness, they carefully moved their handmade flashlights from side to side to see which way the main corridor ran. At that point, they discovered a heavy layer of sediment on the cave floor. To avoid disturbing and scattering it into the water, they realized they needed to keep their motions to a minimum and swim as near to the top of the main route as possible. They also had to be careful with their fins, kicking them out sideways rather than up and down. This is extremely difficult to do in a narrow, constrained cave tunnel. As they went under a big rock overhang into the main path, the last rays of natural light vanished behind them. The dive was enjoyable and uncomplicated at first, but they gradually swam further into the cave. The water was astonishingly clear, shimmering under the beams of their torches as Murray and Donald waded deeper into the cave. The air inside felt cool, and the sound of dripping water echoed softly off the cavern walls. As they moved forward, their lights illuminated a number of side passages that splintered off from the main tunnel. Each one beckoned with a sense of mystery, but the darkness within made it impossible to determine how far they stretched, or where they led. Some looked accessible, but others seemed narrow and forbidding. Murray and Donald hesitated at a few of these side tunnels, leaning in just enough to catch a glimpse of what lay within. But, with their vision limited by the light and the increasing pressure of the cave's atmosphere, they decided against exploring any further. They'd been in the water for roughly 30 minutes, but it felt much longer to Donald, whose growing unease was hard to ignore. After advancing only about 200 feet, or 60 meters, into the cave, Donald abruptly stopped. His breathing had quickened, and he could feel the unmistakable grip of panic tightening in his chest. His instincts were screaming that something was wrong. He glanced at Murray, trying to steady his nerves, but every inch of him was telling him to turn back. The walls felt like they were closing in, and the oppressive weight of the cave pressed down on him in a way that made it hard to breathe. "I think we should go back," Donald said, his voice strained. "I can't shake this feeling. Something's off." He wasn't sure what it was. Maybe it was the eerie silence that hung in the air, or the way the water seemed to ripple with no apparent cause. Whatever it was, Donald knew that if they ventured any further, the situation could spiral out of control. Donald and Murray exchanged subtle signals beneath the surface of the water, communicating without words. Donald, having already returned from his dive, indicated to Murray that it was time to come back, and suggested that they head out together. However, Murray wasn't ready to call it a day. He felt as though he had hardly scratched the surface of the adventure. No real exploration, no challenges faced. In his mind, the day's effort had been unfulfilling. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd fallen short of achieving what he'd set out to do. His sense of purpose remained unmet, and the call to push further tugged at him. Murray in particular seems to be driven by a need for adventure and fulfillment, despite Donald signaling that it's time to wrap up their exploration and leave together. Murray feels like he hasn't accomplished enough. He feels a deep pull to continue, which suggested that his desire for exploration and challenge might lead him to push beyond safe limits. If we were to continue imagining how the story unfolds, we can assume that Murray's decision to stay longer might result in unforeseen consequences. Given the title Radium Cave Disaster, the cave may have dangers that Murray underestimates, perhaps relating to radium exposure or the structural hazards of an underwater cave. As Murray pushes further into the cave, he might encounter increasing difficulties, limited oxygen, disorienting labyrinths, underwater currents, or perhaps even toxic radium deposits that could pose serious health risks. Donald, likely worried about Murray's extended absence, may be torn between staying safe and re-entering the dangerous cave to rescue his friend. In the end, the disaster part of the title might hint at a tragic or near-fatal conclusion. Murray, blinded by his drive for achievement, could succumb to the cave's dangers. Donald might try to save him but be unable to reach him in time, or the two could find themselves trapped. Whether or not they survive, the story seems to warn about the dangers of overreaching in pursuit of adventure, without understanding or respecting the risks involved. And that's the haunting story of the Radium Cave disaster. It's a chilling reminder of how curiosity and science, while powerful, can sometimes lead to tragic consequences. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, make sure to give this video